I was asked by David and the others when I was asked here, and was suggested that I didn't talk about the Perth experience because you've all heard that story. So what I thought I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about some of the research that has come out in the last couple of years in this area that of cities, of transport, and of economic development, and because there has been quite a bit of interesting work done. So I just thought I'd start off with these. These issues are happening around Australia. So this time last week, I was actually rowing the troops in Newcastle, in New South Wales and surrounding towns, and they've been protesting the Rob Jelly. You're all being Victorians, you'd all know Rob Jelly from Sea Change fame. But Rob Jelly type plans to truncate the Sydney-Newcastle rail service 2.5 kilometres out of the CBD of Newcastle, a rail link that's been there for probably 100 years plus. So they decided that they were going to, they were selling this as one of those visionary plans, that the land occupied by the rail was going to be developed as apartments with waterfront views. Now, under this plan, those wanting to make the journey between New South Wales' two biggest cities actually would have to travel the first, depending on which end you came, but either the final or the first 2.5 kilometres by bus, or maybe one day it was possible that they said we'd put light rail in. Now, this would add about 30 minutes to the journey time. What became evident is that really the problem was that what we saw happening there has been part of a technique that has been used by governments, perhaps sometimes unconsciously over the years. But you allow a rail system to decline. You don't modernise that rail system. It's the same as what happened with Perth and the Perth-Fremantle rail line. No modernisation was made. The patronage dropped. It was no longer competitive with the motor vehicle, and this was used as the justification to close it down. Certainly the same thing is happening in Newcastle. The train now takes to travel 177 kilometres. Certainly takes 2 3/4 hours, often 3 hours to make the journey. So it's not surprising that patronage has dropped. But even so, even given this latest decision to truncate the railway line on Boxing Day and replace it with a bus that would add half an hour to the journey, even the Minister for Transport, when queried on this, agreed that it would see an immediate 23% reduction in patronage, but that really wasn't an issue because it wasn't a transport project after all, it was a planning project. Quite extraordinary. So now my message to the safer rail groups down in Newcastle and Maitland was twofold. And firstly, I said, no, make sure that you don't allow those pushing this preposterous plan to clothe themselves with the mantle of progress, because that's what they do. We're visionaries. This is the great new revitalisation of Newcastle, and you're the, save the trees, save the stock change. Rather, you've got to make it clear that those who are not putting fast, efficient rail services right at the heart of city planning are those that are living in the past. And in this case, in the 1980s. Their plans, which is when these plans first emerged and still there, and their plans are about as attractive, as relevant as that fabulous, legendary 1980s hairdo. But the second and related part of that argument must be, of course, the folly of separating land use and transport planning. That we actually had a Minister for Transport who was basically saying, well, I had nothing to do with this project, it's got nothing to do with me and the transport portfolio because this is a planning issue. And we understand that this displays a classic ignorance of how the very fabric of the city and its livability and its productivity is profoundly affected by the mobility of the community, by the ease with which the residents and the workforce of a city can move around to access employment, educated services, entertainment and recreation. And I say this to people, we've really got to understand, and I may have said this to you last time that I met with you, but I think it's a really important point that we've all got to really grasp, is what makes cities so successful, what is it that makes a city work, why cities are the great generators of wealth within nations and across the globe, is the fact that they bring together this specialisation and diversification of skills, that you bring together people with complementary skills and very sophisticated skills that then can leverage off each other. Now, this requires, for that to happen, there needs to be mobility. There needs for the agglomerate, they call them the agglomeration benefits of a city to work. You need free mobility, because if you don't have that mobility, what you've in fact got is sub-cities. That if you're not allowing free and ready interchange of the people, of the industries, of the skill sets within that urban area, then you in fact are losing those agglomeration benefits, which really are the key drivers of the productivity of a city. And look, there's been some recent data that has been collected that I think it's worth us having a look at, that really supports this case for rail being at the heart of the success of the city. And in these areas, this was we all know that in the United States, after the GFC, there was a massive collapse in property prices. And there was a US study by the Centre for Neighbourhood Technology that was commissioned by a number of people, but including the National Association of Realtors. And what they did is they looked at the impact of the GFC on property prices across a variety of cities. And what they were looking for was whether or not, what were the key factors, what could you isolate out as factors that impacted on these property prices. And when they looked at, one of the variables that they looked at were things called a transit shed. And a transit shed was a catchment serviced by a fixed public transport network, whether or not it was a fixed guideway, whether or not it was rail, heavy rail or light rail, is what they were calling a transit shed. And what they found that on average, that in each region, in each city that they looked at, that the transit shed, that area that was serviced by rail, outperformed the region in which they were located by about 41%. And in all regions, in every region that they looked at, the drop in average residential sales prices within the transit shed was smaller than in the region as a whole. And, in some of these places like Minneapolis and St. Paul, the transit shed area outperformed 48%, San Francisco and Phoenix 37%, and Chicago 30%. So there was a very high correlation between the closeness to public transport and the maintenance of those property prices. And they said that these had, this is seen to have a number of really significant policy ramifications, and it does speak to the resilience of a resilience of an area and how you can build economic resilience into an area by investment in public transport. So it's a little bit arcane, but it does show that accessibility is an important part of developing a resilience in a city in the face of economic challenges. Now, the second piece of research that is quite interesting and relatively recent research has been done by Peter Newman, Jeff Penworthy and Gary Glazebrook, the first two obviously from from Western Australia. And their research shows that we are possibly reaching something which they call peak car use. So they've looked at the overall growth of car use in the world's cities, and they've looked at them across these different decades. And what you can see is that there has been, obviously, there was in the 60s, you would expect, with increased affluence, a rapid rise in car use. But that rise in car use and car travel across cities really has been the rate of growth, and it is still growing. We can't gild the lily here, it is still growing. But that rate of growth has been declining quite dramatically, and in particular in the last decade that they had access to data. This is a paper that came out last year, but the last decade that they were able to access was the 95 to 2005, and we see, so that is, and they believe that we're going to be reaching a thing that is called peak car use, that this exponential growth of cars, of car travel, it will not continue forever. We're coming across some massive constraints. Now, this one, sorry, that's not very clear, it's not very good, sorry, I apologise for that. I will circulate these after if you like, but this here is supposed to show, I don't know whether you can read it, but it does show in US cities, Canadian cities, Australian, European, Singapore and Hong Kong, the increase in rail patronage, both in public transport boardings per person and passenger kilometres per person. And in particular, in the US cities, we see rail is up 20 to 25%. Now, admittedly, that's from a pretty low base. Canadian cities are up by 17 to 20% and now overtaking Australian cities, which have improved by between 6 and 11%. And we see the European cities increasing by 10 to 20% off a high base, and Singapore and Hong Kong. So what we see is a very significant growth in use of public transport generally, but rail in particular, and not so, and yet the rate of increase in car travel in cities is actually reducing. So it's the rate of growth is reducing, whereas the rate of growth in public transport is increasing. This is another view of that, which shows the public transport kilometres per capita by region, and it contrasts the 1995 figures with the 2005 figures, so you can see the increases that are occurring. And I think, you know, very clearly the driver, and we're using this again, focus here is where should we be putting our infrastructure dollars? Should we be putting the infrastructure dollars into catering for growth in roads, or should we be putting those infrastructure dollars into catering for rail usage? So we see those increases that are going on there, and congestion is obviously clogging the cities, and this is really the driver for this move to rail. This is quite an interesting one. It's a little bit hard to grasp just like this, but what it actually shows is, and if you, the figure of 1, if you look at that 1 point, is the equivalent of what the road transport speed is, and it shows the public transport system as a whole, and starting with 1960 going across each decade, and showing that the public transport systems as a whole continue, when you aggregate bus and rail, continue to operate below that 1, which means that they are less time efficient, that it takes a longer travel time in public transport by car. But if you go to the rail speeds, you will see that the rail speeds compared to the road speeds have been increasing. And again, we get back, I mean, what this research is, this is an aggregation across cities. But what this is basically showing us is a worldwide trend that the rail speeds compared to car speeds are increasing, and relying on public transport that is a bus-oriented system is not going to get us to quite that space, because that continues to be well south of road transport of car speeds. So we all know the holy grail in public transport that you need to be competitive with the motor vehicle if you're going to get people making that choice. You will get people that have no choice, but where people have a choice, and they are people that we want to attract as well, getting people out of their cars as willing participants in the public transport system. The key thing is that you have to be able to present them with an option that is time competitive. And I think it's interesting to look at this statistic that was in, I think, the Kenworthy-Newman paper, which shows the annual average rail boardings in Perth and Adelaide. And they show that difference between Perth and Adelaide. I'm not saying that Adelaide's not trying, but because their system has fundamentally been a bus-based system, it just simply has not been able to attract that increase in boardings. And again, it goes back to that notion of the ability to compete in terms of speed with the congested roads. Now again, and I hope some of these things aren't, but I'm presuming because you're all public transport activists that this might not be too obscure. But this is work that has been done by Jeff Kenworthy in particular. And so he's just recently produced this interesting research showing that traditional linkage between increased wealth and increased car use is breaking down. So that traditionally, it's always been thought as a city, as the residents of the city become more wealthy, then you will see increased car use. So this has traditionally been done by linking car use with GDP use, with growth in GDP. And so what we can see, and so this is contrasting 1995 with 2005, and the figures compare the passenger kilometres as per dollar of GDP, right? So they're looking at what was the GDP and comparing that with passenger kilometres. And there has been traditionally a very strong linkage that as your GDP goes up, then so will your car use. But what we're seeing here is that this is beginning to break down. And you see that difference between the blue, which is the 1995 figure, and the red, which is the 2005 figure, showing that correlation is weakening, and that the connection is getting softer. We would obviously, there's prediction that will continue to decline. So not something that sort of leaps off the page necessarily to members of the general public, but for those that are analysing transport trends, it is showing that the strength of that correlation between growth in GDP and car use is beginning to be decoupled. Now, just one further thing, one final thing that I think, because I think a lot of people don't realise what is going on in the Middle East and in North Africa. And this is really one of the quite extraordinary things here. And we all know, we probably often hear about what's happening in Asia, and which is pretty fabulous. But it's really what's happening in the Middle East and the Gulf states. And in this area, which basically includes, for this purposes, Egypt, there is $200 billion worth of rail projects, $200 billion worth of rail projects that are either under construction, or either have just recently been completed, or under construction, or in the planning phase. And this is just a list of those. I mean, the figures really are quite extraordinary. And this just shows some of them, and look at Saudi Arabia. It's quite extraordinary. New metro rail projects are being planned in Jeddah, Mecca, Kuwait City and Abu Dhabi. And there are projects that have been already constructed. I'm not sure if we've got any more slides, sorry, we've got a bit, no, we perhaps haven't got any further slides. But you might have one, this one, of the new system in Dubai. Now, I'm particularly interested in this one. So Dubai opened its metro rail project in 2009 with 75 kilometres of rail built, and I think it was something like 91 stations. And within the first 2 days, 10% of the population had used the network, and the take-up rate has been great, and there's very considerable expansions being planned. Now, I find this one particularly interesting because in 2003, early 2003, I was in Dubai for a variety of reasons and met with the Minister for Transport. And I'd been out the day before and had seen these massive, this is when they were doing that whole Palm development, and these huge projects that were being built, and they were being built by a West Australian company, Multiplex. So we went out into the site, been inside the fact that it looked like the slave scene out of, the scene out of Ben Hur where the slaves are building the pyramids. It was quite clear this was going to be, there was only one road in and one road out of this massive development. And so I spoke to the Transport Minister about public transport, and were they planning to build some public transport? And his response was, we don't need public transport in Dubai. I mean, all of our people are wealthy enough to have cars. And I said, well, I'm not sure that really is the point anymore. It's about actually making the city work, and very wealthy people in London catch the tube. I went home and I sent him a copy of Peter Newman and Jeff Kenworthy's book, Cities and Automobile Dependence. Now, I don't like to say that's why they ended up getting a rail, but I think we saw there that in these states we have seen a very, very rapid embrace of the need for public transport, that a realisation that to make, and these are not, shall we say, governments that you normally associate with sustainability, but they have quite clearly come to see that if they want to make their cities truly livable and economically efficient and productive, that they are going to have to get themselves fit for the 21st century. And so we see these massive developments going on. I'll just take that one back. At the moment, under construction is the Doha Metro, and that's a $15 billion project. That's got 234 kilometres of above and below ground rail, 4 lines and 96 stations. They're also building at the same time a light rail. And Saudi Arabia, I think we listed some of those projects, but at the moment actually under construction are $20 billion worth of metropolitan rail projects. So we can see extraordinary things are happening, and I just think it's tragic that we have now got in Australia, we are now led by a Prime Minister who has absolutely no appetite for public transport, who in his famous book, The Battle Lines, describes public transport as slow and uncomfortable, and who says that when a man gets in his car, he is a king in his castle. And so whilst we're seeing, even in those oil-rich Gulf states, they are embracing rail as the way to drive their cities forward. In Australia, we are led by a government who sees rail something only poor people do, and you only do, and it is antiquated, and real liberty and glory happens in the privacy of your car. It is, in fact, a very, very anti-urban philosophy. It is the philosophy of people, I believe, that have come out of the Industrial Revolution hating cities and not realising that cities are, in fact, can be vital and engaging and desirable places, provided that we ensure that we have this high level of mobility across those cities, that a city that we're not spending hours in our cars, that we're able to access all parts of the city readily through public transport, that we have cities that are environmentally desirable to live in, have high air quality, and indeed just simply work. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is my case. That is, I guess, just a few tidbits about the latest research showing that the trends in the 21st century, seeing where cities are going, will tell us that priority of investment should in fact be on expanding our rail network rather than expanding our road networks. Thank you very much.